She thought she married the love of her life, a man she trusted with everything she had, a man who stood beside her, promising forever in front of family, friends, and a future that seemed certain. And for a time, everything about their life together looked real, stable, even ordinary. But just weeks after her father died, everything began to unravel in a way no one around her could have imagined. Because the man she loved did not just walk away quietly, he filed for divorce, and almost immediately he reappeared beside someone else she trusted just as deeply. Her closest friend, the person who had stood next to her through years of shared memories, laughter, and private conversations. And what followed was not just a betrayal of love, it was something far more calculated, something that, according to reports and later legal filings, would raise serious questions about timing, motive, and intention. Because as the truth slowly surfaced, investigators and legal experts began to suspect that this was never simply about a broken marriage, and that behind the sudden divorce, the new relationship, and the speed at which everything changed, there may have been knowledge about a secret that had been hidden for years, a secret tied to her father, a man who, to the outside world, lived quietly and without attention, but who, as it would later emerge, had built an empire worth billions, a fortune that remained almost completely invisible until the moment he passed away. And in that moment, everything shifted, because the woman at the center of this story was not who everyone believed she was. And the man who left her may have believed he was making the smartest decision of his life. But what he did next would set off a chain of events that would expose not only the truth about her family, but also the intentions of the people closest to her. And as you watch this unfold, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Was this simply a coincidence of timing? Or was it something far more deliberate, something planned long before the divorce papers were ever placed in her hands? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Emily Carter had always lived a life that felt quietly ordinary, the kind of life that rarely draws attention or raises questions. And to those around her, why she was known as someone dependable, warm, and deeply loyal to the people she loved. She worked a steady job, kept a small circle of friends, and valued the kind of simple routines that made life feel stable. But there was one part of her life that always seemed slightly out of place, something she never fully explained, and no one ever pressed too hard to understand. And that was her relationship with her father, a man who appeared only occasionally, never stayed long, and spoke very little about his own life, according to those who knew Emily. She rarely mentioned him in detail, and when she did, it was always in passing, as if there was nothing particularly unusual about a father who remained so distant. But looking back, some would later say that distance may have meant more than anyone realized at the time. Her father lived in a way that seemed almost deliberately modest. He avoided attention, kept his routines private, and maintained very few visible connections. There were no signs of luxury, no public achievements, no clear indication that he was anything other than a quiet older man living a simple life. And yet, according to reports that surfaced later, this outward simplicity may have concealed something far more significant, because investigators and financial analysts would eventually discover that his name was quietly connected to a network of companies and investments that stretched far beyond what anyone in Emily's life could have imagined. But during those earlier years, none of that was visible. And for Emily, he was simply her father. He's someone she respected, someone she cared about, even if she never fully understood him. It was during this seemingly stable period of her life that Emily met Daniel Reeves, a man who, from the beginning, stood in contrast to the quiet simplicity she was used to. Daniel was confident, driven, and openly ambitious, the kind of person who spoke about future plans with certainty and carried himself with a sense of purpose that drew people in, according to friends. Their connection developed quickly, and what Emily found in Daniel was not just companionship, but a sense of direction, someone who seemed to know exactly where he was going and was willing to bring her along with him. And for a while, everything about their relationship appeared genuine, built on shared goals and mutual trust, at least on the surface. As their relationship deepened, another important figure remained close to Emily's life, her best friend Sarah Collins, someone who had been by her side long before Daniel entered the picture. Sarah was present through many of Emily's milestones, offering support, sharing in her happiness, and becoming a familiar part of the couple's life as well. According to those who observed them, the three of them seemed comfortable together, often spending time in the same spaces, building what looked like a strong and interconnected bond. But in hindsight, some would later question whether certain moments, small and easily overlooked at the time, may have hinted at dynamics that were not fully understood. There were occasions, subtle and easily dismissed, where Daniel appeared slightly more attentive when Sarah was around, or where conversations seemed to carry a tone that Emily did not immediately notice. And while none of these moments were clear or obvious enough to raise alarm, they would later become part of a larger pattern that investigators and observers would revisit when trying to understand how everything unfolded. Because at the time, Emily trusted both of them completely, and there was no reason for her to suspect that the two people closest to her could be connected in a way that would eventually change her life. For years, her life moved forward in what felt like a steady and predictable direction. Her relationship with Daniel strengthened, her friendship with Sarah remained intact, and her father continued to exist on the edges of her world, present but distant, familiar yet mysterious. Torn, and nothing about that balance seemed urgent or unstable. But as later accounts would suggest, it was within that calm and ordinary rhythm that the foundation of everything was quietly forming, and that what appeared to be a simple life may have been far more complex beneath the surface than anyone, including Emily herself, could have understood at the time. As time went on, the rhythm of Emily Carter's life continued to feel steady, almost predictable, and that sense of stability became something she relied on without question. Her relationship with Daniel Reeves moved forward with the kind of quiet confidence that made the future seem secure, and those close to them often described their bond as balanced, with Emily bringing warmth and patience, while Daniel brought direction and ambition, and together, they appeared to complement each other in a way that made their marriage feel natural, almost inevitable. And when they finally stood together and made that commitment, it seemed like the beginning of something lasting, something built on trust, shared plans, and a belief that they both wanted the same things. But according to later accounts, there may have been subtle differences in what each of them truly valued. Differences that were not immediately visible, but would eventually become impossible to ignore. Daniel's ambition, while often seen as a strength, began to take on a more noticeable presence in their daily lives. He spent more time focused on work, more time thinking about opportunities, and more time pursuing ideas that promised growth and success. And while Emily supported him, there were moments when his attention seemed divided, moments where conversations felt shorter, where his focus shifted elsewhere. And though these changes were gradual, they created a quiet distance that was difficult to define, but increasingly hard to dismiss. And still, Emily remained committed to the life they were building, believing that these shifts were simply part of growing responsibilities and not a sign of something deeper. At the same time, Sarah Collins remained closely involved in Emily's life, continuing to offer support, spending time with both of them, and maintaining the same presence she had always had. But as the months passed, certain interactions began to stand out in ways that were subtle but meaningful, according to those who later reflected on these moments. There were instances where Sarah and Daniel appeared unusually aligned in conversation, where their exchanges carried a familiarity that extended beyond casual interaction. And while none of it seemed out of place in the moment, it would later become part of the narrative that raised questions about when certain boundaries may have started to blur. Emily's father, meanwhile, remained consistent in his distance. His visits were still infrequent, his communication still limited, and his lifestyle unchanged. And if anything, his absence from the details of her life made it easier for everything else to unfold without interruption, because there was no external influence, no interference, nothing that would disrupt the balance she believed she had. And yet, according to information that would only come to light later, this quiet separation may have played a role in how events were allowed to progress without scrutiny, because the less that was known about him, the easier it was for others to overlook the significance of his position. Then gradually, something began to shift in a way that felt different from before. Daniel's behavior became less predictable, his routines less consistent, and his attention more fragmented. There were moments when he seemed preoccupied, moments when he withdrew without explanation, and while Emily tried to make sense of it, there was never enough evidence to form a clear conclusion, only a growing sense that something was changing beneath the surface, something she could feel but not yet fully understand. And it was during this period, according to later timelines, that key decisions may have already been forming, and decisions that would soon move from possibility into action. What made this shift even more significant was how closely it followed the final days of her father's life. Because while Emily was focused on processing that loss, dealing with the emotional weight of it, and adjusting to a new reality without him, other changes were happening at the same time. Changes that, according to reports, appeared too closely aligned to be dismissed entirely as coincidence. And as investigators would later examine the sequence of events, the timing would become one of the most important factors in understanding what may have truly been happening behind the scenes. Because within weeks of that loss, everything that once felt stable began to come apart in rapid and unexpected ways. In the days that followed her father's passing, Emily Carter found herself moving through a quiet kind of grief, the kind that doesn't always show itself outwardly, but lingers in small moments, in empty spaces, in conversations that never happen again. And while she tried to hold on to some sense of normalcy, there was an undeniable shift in her world, one that made everything feel slightly off balance. And yet, as she focused on processing that loss, something else was changing at the same time. Something less visible, but far more immediate. Because according to later accounts, it was during this exact period that Daniel Reeves began to act in ways that were noticeably different from before. His presence became inconsistent, his tone more distant, and his attention increasingly difficult to reach. And while Emily initially believed this was simply a reaction to stress or circumstance, the pattern that followed would suggest something more deliberate. There were moments, subtle at first, where Daniel would step away to take calls he did not explain. Moments where he seemed distracted even when he was physically present, and moments where conversations ended without resolution, leaving behind a sense of disconnection that Emily struggled to understand. And according to individuals familiar with the situation, these changes did not occur gradually over a long period of time, but rather appeared within a relatively short window, closely aligned with the timing of her father's death, a detail that would later become central to the questions surrounding motive and intent. Because as these behaviors continued, they began to form a pattern that was difficult to ignore. At the same time, Sarah Collins remained close. She was offering support in ways that seemed consistent with the role she had always played. She checked in regularly, spent time with Emily, and presented herself as someone dependable during a difficult period. And yet, according to later observations, there were instances where her presence overlapped with Daniel's in ways that were not immediately apparent to Emily. Moments that seemed ordinary on the surface, but would later take on a different meaning when viewed through the lens of everything that followed. And while there was still no clear evidence of anything inappropriate at that stage, the alignment of their actions, their availability, and their timing would eventually become part of a broader pattern that investigators and analysts would examine more closely. Then came the moment that would mark a clear turning point, a moment that, according to reports, happened without warning and without the kind of conversation that usually precedes such a decision. Daniel filed for divorce, and for Emily, the shock was not just in the decision itself, but in the speed and finality with which it was presented. There was no attempt to repair, no extended discussion, no visible hesitation, just a legal step that brought everything they had built to an abrupt end. And while divorces are often complex and emotional, the timing of this one, coming so soon after her father's death, raised immediate questions among those who later reviewed the sequence of events, because it suggested that the decision may not have been formed in response to recent circumstances alone. What followed only deepened that sense of uncertainty, because almost immediately after the divorce process began, Daniel was seen in the company of Sarah in a way that was no longer subtle or open to interpretation. Their connection became visible, public, and difficult to reconcile with the timeline Emily believed to be true. And according to accounts that surfaced later, this transition from private familiarity to public relationship occurred with a speed that led many to question when it had truly begun. Because if it appeared this quickly, it may have existed long before it was ever acknowledged. And for Emily, the realization that the two people she trusted most were now connected in this way was not just painful, it fundamentally changed her understanding of everything that had come before. As these events unfolded, the focus began to shift beyond the emotional impact and toward the underlying reasons. Because while the betrayal itself was clear, the motive behind it remained uncertain. And it was at this point, according to reports, that another development began to surface. one that would transform the entire situation from a personal crisis into something far more complex. Because shortly after the divorce proceedings were set in motion, Emily was contacted regarding matters related to her father's estate, and what she was about to learn would not only redefine her understanding of her family, but would also raise a new and far more significant question: whether the timing of everything that had just happened was truly coincidental, or whether it had been influenced by information that she herself did not yet have access to. The call came at a moment when Emily Carter was still trying to process everything that had already happened. And at first it seemed routine, a formal step that often follows the passing of a parent. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that this was something very different, something far beyond what she had expected. Because according to the legal representatives handling her father's affairs, there were assets, holdings, and interests that required her immediate attention. And not in the way she might have imagined, not in small amounts or simple transfers, but in a scale that was difficult to fully comprehend in a single moment. And as documents were presented and details explained, the picture that emerged began to reshape everything she thought she knew about her father. Because the man who had lived quietly, who had kept his distance and avoided attention, had in fact built and maintained a vast network of investments and companies, a structure that, according to financial records, extended across multiple sectors and regions. And at the center of it all, named as the primary beneficiary, was Emily. As more information surfaced, the magnitude of that reality became impossible to ignore. Because this was not a modest inheritance, it was a fortune that reached into the billions, a level of wealth that carried with it not only financial power, but also responsibility, scrutiny, and consequence. And as Emily began to understand the extent of what had been left to her, the timing of everything else in her life began to take on a new and unsettling meaning. Because according to those who later examined the sequence of events, the alignment between her father's passing, with a sudden shift in Daniel Reeves's behavior, the filing of the divorce, and the rapid emergence of his relationship with Sarah Collins appeared too closely connected to be dismissed without question. And while there was no immediate public confirmation of intent, investigators and legal analysts would later suggest that the possibility of prior knowledge, or at least informed suspicion, could not be entirely ruled out. It was at this stage that attention turned toward the details of the estate itself, because within the legal framework of her father's holdings, there were specific conditions, clauses that governed how the inheritance would be managed and under what circumstances it could be affected, and according to legal interpretations. These provisions were designed to protect the integrity of the estate and the interests of the beneficiary. And as those clauses were reviewed more closely, one in particular began to stand out, because it addressed situations involving undue influence, manipulation, or attempts to gain control through personal relationships. And while the language was formal and precise, the implication was clear that any effort to exploit the heir for access to the estate could trigger consequences that would limit or eliminate any potential benefit. As this information became clearer, the broader situation began to shift once again, because if the timing of the divorce and the new relationship had been influenced by expectations surrounding the inheritance, then those expectations may have been based on an incomplete understanding of the legal reality, and according to reports, this realization introduced a new layer of complexity, one that affected not only the outcome, but also the relationships involved. Because what may have initially appeared to be a strategic decision could, under these conditions, lead to consequences that were the exact opposite of what had been intended. And while specific outcomes remain subject to legal processes and private negotiations, the overall direction of events suggested that the situation was far from straightforward. In the months that followed, the public visibility of Daniel and Sarah's relationship appeared to change. Their presence became less prominent, their interactions less visible, and according to observers, there were indications of strain. Though details remained largely private, and while it would be an oversimplification to attribute those changes to a single cause, the broader context in which they occurred, including the unfolding understanding of the estate and its conditions, provided a framework that many found difficult to ignore, because it reinforced the idea that actions taken without full awareness of underlying factors can lead to outcomes that are both unexpected and irreversible. For Emily, the process of moving forward was not defined solely by the financial reality she had inherited, but by the clarity that came with it. Because while the events surrounding her father's passing, her divorce, and the betrayal she experienced had fundamentally altered her life. They also revealed something that could not be measured in financial terms. Hona, the true nature of the relationships around her, and the difference between those who remained consistent in times of uncertainty and those whose actions shifted when circumstances changed. And according to those who later reflected on her situation, that understanding became one of the most significant outcomes of everything she had gone through. In the end, this was not simply a story about wealth or even about betrayal. It was a story about timing, perception, and the hidden factors that can shape decisions in ways that are not immediately visible. Because when viewed from the outside, the sequence of events might appear coincidental, a series of unrelated developments occurring close together. But when examined more closely with the benefit of hindsight and additional information, it raises a more difficult question, one that remains open to interpretation, whether what happened was the result of chance or whether it reflected a level of awareness that existed before the truth was fully revealed. And that question, perhaps more than anything else, is what continues to define how this story is understood. Because sometimes the most important thing a person can gain is not what is left to them, but what is revealed to them. And in Emily Carter's case, what was revealed changed everything, not just in terms of what she had, but in terms of who she could trust and who she could not. And while the full details of every decision and every intention may never be completely known, the outcome remains clear, that in a moment when everything seemed to fall apart, the truth, once uncovered, provided a kind of clarity that no one involved could ignore. And in that clarity, the real story was finally understood, not as it first appeared, but as it truly was beneath the surface.